folks. Welcome to Decoding Cloud Credits. And we're going to be talking today about free credits from clouds, how they can lock you in, the problems they cause, some of the good, but a lot of the bad and the ugly. Thank you for joining us. Before we dive in, just a couple of housekeeping things. There is a comment section. Maybe chime in right now with where you're dialing in from. If you're okay with that. And then as we go throughout the webinar, you're welcome to put questions in there. I'll try to watch that and see if we can dynamically answer those as we go. There will also be a time for Q&A at the end. So feel free to put questions in the comment box and we will address that as we go. And let's go ahead and dive in and start with some introductions. Simon, you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, very simple. Simon, I am one of the directors at Civo and spent the last 20 years in the cloud industry in different infrastructure companies as CTO, CEO, and working internationally. So, got a very good understanding of the cloud market.
Great, thanks. Yep. And James, why don't you tell us about you?
Thanks, Kendall, and happy to be here. So James Marks, founder, CEO of Canopy. We help organizations procure cloud services as a cloud broker, and prior to this, I spent 7 years working at Amazon and AWS, and so have got, as Simon touched on, a good understanding of the market and helping customers navigate cloud credits, but then more broadly, cloud procurement.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Simon. And my name's Kendall. I've been at Civo for about a year, helping on the business development side and some partnership things as well. So I'm glad to be here with y'all and hosting this. With that said, let's dive in. So this is mostly going to be a discussion today, and that's part of why feel free to post some questions in there. We're going to work through a number of questions on our end, and happy to mix some things in if we need to. So to get us started. James, what are cloud credits?
So cloud credits are effectively a form of virtual currency, which cloud providers often hand out to startups, but then also to businesses to do proof of concepts as a way in which they can effectively use those cloud services and underlying infrastructure, but not have to pay for it. And so particularly for startups, you'll see that there's large chunks of credits being given, and I will touch on it later, to allow these customers to use those services without having to pay anything. A whole host of different reasons, but that's the main use case.
Yeah. Anything to add to that, Simon, before we keep going?
Well, I kind of think, the background to cloud credits, if you think of it, is probably three things. Companies, startups wanted to have a number of credits for one of three reasons. One is to test their application and maybe the architecture of their application to make sure it actually works on that particular cloud platform. Secondly, they want confidence. The cloud platform's available, secure, it's got the capacity, the performance that they wanted. Maybe it's got the tool set or allows rapid innovation. And third, you want cost subsidization. You're either ramping your application up and you don't really want to pay for it until you've ramped it up, or more likely you're migrating from somewhere and you want that cost subsidized so that you're not paying for dual running. So those are the kind of drivers in the background of where this first came from. You probably need to really think or challenge yourself about what's the strategic purpose of having tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, actually in some cases millions of dollars worth of credits. And there's an old adage, Kendall, that we all know about. I don't think it's just a British one, but it says that there's nothing like a free lunch. That just doesn't exist. And the word free automatically has a cognitive bias. We all attract to something free, and we tend to forget about other important things. things like budgets, it's competition, maybe architectural risks, usage risks. And therefore, in my opinion, it's no doubt that the hyperscalers in particular, who are giving huge amounts of free credits, is calculated business. Yeah? There's people that have equated it to drug dealers handing out on the street corner, giving free drugs. They give free samples for a couple of months because they know at the end of it, you're hooked. You're not going elsewhere.
Yeah.
And I think we'll be discussing that today. Cloud credits really do get you hooked and lock you in. And there's a real danger there that people need to be aware of.
Yeah, well, so the beginning of that is, here's what they are, and part of the reason that they're free should make you wonder why they're free. I wonder what their motivation is in that, right? So well, let's dive in from there. And Simon, like, what are the primary concerns associated with the adoption of free credits broadly? How does it impact a business in the long run?
Yeah, I think you certainly get short-term savings, but I think that really masks the long-term liabilities that you potentially are getting into. And there's a whole range of things, and it affects different people, different companies to different extents. But let's go through a few of them. Definitely, it's vendor lock-in. It's that free drugs because you're going to keep coming back. By having free credits, you tend to be very lazy architecturally. You kind of don't design for the final part, to the payment part. You're kind of just using it. You're being lazy how you architecture. You're being maybe not thinking about some of those design decisions, usage decisions. And therefore, absolutely, you get kind of bloated and inefficient infrastructure. That is often the end result is you haven't thought about the usage. You haven't made design decisions about in-life production. And therefore, it results in bill shock. And actually, in the white paper that we'll be sharing later today, bill shock is a big part of that. A couple of statistics. There was 28% of the survey we did. 28% of the respondents said that they believed that free credits actually locked them in to longer term, higher costs longer term, because they didn't do those kind of initial design things that you should have done for efficiency.
When you're trying to be scrappy as a startup and you're say bootstrapped and you're pinching every penny, you use the least amount of services in the most affordable way because you have to. And if somebody hands you a bucket of money, you just go sign up for the most expensive database because it'll scale, even though you won't scale for 5 more years. And so then that runway runs out, and all of a sudden you're going, holy cow, what did I sign up for? That's what you're talking about there, right?
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that to life. Those are really good examples. Similarly, you've got free credits and you've got kind of this lovely feature list of things that you could use. And most technical people will start going, let me try that. Let me evaluate that. Let me start using this without really any business justification of why they should be using those features. But you come out of a long trial at the end of a year, you've architectured those features into your application, and to take them out is a big cost, a big task, and is typically not done, and it leaves that technical debt within what you're doing.
Yeah.
The other figure that we saw was that in the survey was that 70% of the respondents said that they saw lack of visibility to actually what they were spending, because again, they were just using it free, and then at the end of the period, the business, procurement, compliance, others were going, well, why are we using this? Well, what are those features giving us? Why are we using it in this one? So at the end of the day, I certainly a big believer that lock-in suppresses innovation, suppresses agility, because you've got all of that technical debt. No longer your priority to solve that problem.
Yeah.
James, I'm sure you've got other examples.
Yeah, I think it really obviously depends on where they're at that journey. I think, Kendall, you touched on, like, at the beginning, it's effectively like a lifeline for some of these businesses, right? That they get given some of these, and it can help innovation in the short term, particularly when you are a capital constrained business and you're looking to innovate, but at a lower cost. However, as Simon's alluded to, without having, and we'll touch on this later, some of the governance in place and really understanding the long-term implications of some of your decision making, that's when actually it starts to hurt businesses or limit businesses later on, from both a commercial perspective, but then also from an agility perspective. And also, you've got to factor in the way in which they're consumed, this almost limitless bucket of credits, right? It can create overusage and ultimately companies building infrastructure when I'm a big believer in a resource constrained environment. You actually produce better, more efficient infrastructure. Whereas obviously these credits, it promotes quite the opposite.
Yeah. Simon, were you done with that topic before I move on?
Yeah, I think so. I trust it's very clear that there's a real danger there. It needs to be thought about. It needs to be planned.
Yeah. And so we've touched on some of this, James, but our next question is, how do hyperscalers use cloud credits to attract and retain customers, and what are the potential consequences of the strategy? So, I mean, it's kind of a continuation, but is there anything else you want to add to that?
So I think obviously that's initial attraction for using certain providers, and it's promoted within the ecosystem, where you're a venture-backed business or even bootstrapped. You can effectively get access to credits of some nature. And actually, if you are a VC-backed business, you get even more. And that can continue for the first, I've seen companies 4 years down the line still consuming cloud credits, and they tend to kind of cycle through different providers as well. But it's really that main attraction, and it is fairly generous at the beginning, particularly with some of the hyperscalers. And from that, the expectation is that you then use, maybe some of their proprietary tools, like platform native tools, which ultimately deepen your reliance on that specific provider. And so with limited barriers to that being used, you can often find that customers get themselves entrenched, and they're using lots of different services. Even for companies that are sort of 2-3 years in, we've seen them with tons of sort of microservices, which make it, again, difficult. And in turn, obviously, they tend to then retain those customers. So where we've seen a lot of these sort of scale-up businesses, when they're rolling off the credits, the typical go-to in those instances, because it's difficult to migrate, is to renew. They obviously then ensure that they then continue to build on those specific platforms. And that's obviously something which, as consumers of credits, and even ourselves as a business, we're consumers of credits, and I know other cloud providers outside of hyperscalers offer these. You've just got to be understanding these methods to ensure that you build in a way that's efficient, resourceful, but doesn't constrain yourself when you get to that sort of end stage of rolling off credits. And you, as Simon touched on, you get the bill shock, which for some companies can be detrimental, and even I've seen it put some companies under in terms of their P&L. Quite critical, particularly in this day and age where a lot of AI companies, a lot of businesses are heavily reliant on their IT infrastructure to basically as a core part of their business.
I mean, I think one interesting thing on the other side of this coin that I've also seen businesses do is, we've touched a lot on, you're now locked in, and the only thing you can do is to renew, and your spend stays super high. But I've also seen organizations fall into the opposite trap, which is, oh my gosh, my cloud credits are expiring. They run to another cloud, negotiate a huge cloud credit, and then instead of building their product, they spend the next 3 months migrating everything. And then when those credits run out, they go to the third hyperscaler and try to do the same thing. And they end up in this loop of just, well, I can't afford what I've architected, period. Yep. And so the only option that I have is to try to jump between them. And instead of building my product, I'm spending all of my time migrating between places, which is the other side of the same very bad coin.
It is. I see the best companies, absolutely no question. They are saying, I'm building this architecture for portability. So I'm very conscious of what features I use, and I restrict or have none that are proprietary to the platform. So they can migrate very, very quickly. Now, that might be to another round of free credits, but that doesn't last long. You can only go round the vendors once. They're doing it for that long-term portability, that long-term ability to have optionality and to be able to negotiate, because you can't otherwise. And in fact, the slide that we just showed up again in the white paper, the three phases, the entrench phase is the bit that lasts the longest. The vendors are very conscious that if you are not building in proprietary features, your credit phase gets reduced. The more you build proprietary features and they know you're locked in, they don't mind extending that period for longer while you lock yourself in further until there's I've got your moment. Okay, so it's the entrenched period that one needs to be very careful of. As I say, the best companies very aware of this, and they're building for portability on day one.
Yeah, so talk a little bit more about that. I mean, what does building for portability look like? Is it just not using the custom services for that cloud? Is there something else that goes into it? What all is impacted by that decision?
Well, I think it's largely that. It's knowledge of the feature set. If I architecture this feature set, or very importantly to SDKs, APIs, very importantly, because those are easily forgotten. If I'm going to a proprietary set, I am not moving short term, because I've got to re-architect, I've got to re-platform, redesign before I re-platform. That takes time and money. Maybe not money that's paid by credits, but money from the real business, paying for salaries, diversions from other things that benefit the business.
James, what were you going to add to that?
I mean, obviously, having a good understanding of what portability looks like within your existing infrastructure requires you to have a multi-cloud setup, or at least be embracing that sort of multi-cloud environment, looking at like open source models, and embracing open cloud, but then also looking down sort of containerized workloads, looking at Kubernetes. There's other sort of things which you can apply into your infrastructure. And Simon said it, being cost conscious so that you're running a lean IT stack allows you to be a lot more mobile later on. And we've seen it with some customers who have born on a hyperscaler or others, and they hit that inflection point of which then they see the actual monthly burn rate. And I was even off a call today with another company who have seen that burn rate for sort of 2-3 months, and they're now getting board pressure to reduce that down by 30-40%. And they can't maintain the same. They either have to make a decision to completely re-platform, which is taking 3 months of their teams out of action, producing new features, or reduce down their feature set and completely re-architect their whole platform, which again is not only the cost of doing that internally, but the impact that has on some of your customers. What does that look like? And this was a company dealing with enterprise customers. And so you need to ensure that And I think it just comes back to thinking long term about some of the decisions you're making now, and getting it right first time. I'm a big believer in that in terms of architecturing, and it'll pay dividends. You might have a bit of a short-term pain, but the gain is there in the long term.
I saw a very, very good example of that 8 years ago. Within public sector, there was a large government department that were building a new application, spent, I think, if I remember, about £3 million on, an outsourcer to develop that application. And the hosting fee, the cloud fee, was about 200 grand a year. And they initially went to a cloud provider that they said longer term they had no intention to continue using. It was really a stopgap. But because they designed the application to that platform, 8 years later, they're still on that platform. Yeah. And it's a great example of where you looked in.
Well, and I think James touched on too some of the, you even just mentioned Kubernetes, James, and the cloud providers now, most of them tend to have a hosted Kubernetes environment. But what's different about that is that Kubernetes itself is open source, and the clouds resisted this because it is a portability feature. If you're locked into one of the platforms as a service that each of these clouds provides, it's much harder to migrate than it is if you're picking something like Kubernetes, which, this whole thing isn't just entirely a plug for Civo, but the nice thing about Civo is that being Kubernetes focused is aimed at that. You can come in from anywhere, and if you choose, you can go to someplace else because it's built on open standards. But it's not just the compute standard. There's databases you can choose that are open source. There's everything from key value stores and so forth. You can pick all the proprietary, difficult to migrate bits, or you can make those decisions that have those long-term impacts. And I wanted to talk about this slide for a second, James, as this relates. No spend caps in place with GCP. What is the $450,000 here?
So this was a case study within the paper that we produced, but effectively, as it says on the screen, where companies were rolling off credits, didn't have basically a view of what their burn rate was, and racked up a $450,000 bill within 45 days. And so without the governance, and we'll get onto some strategies of how to manage this, or at least get ahead of it. This is like a real case example of where it can impact a business. And obviously for that business, they didn't have nearly half the amount of budget needed to surface and maintain this level of spend.
Yeah, we've touched upon it. It's around laziness, and technical teams quite naturally and quite understandably feel isolated from cost during this period, and they are not elegant or thinking about ROI. They're thinking about ease of use, ease of development, speed of development, features that either can help or technically look elegant. I like my analogies. It's a bit like going for a food buffet. You've got all this wonderful food in front of you. If you go there every day, you might get very fat. You'll be very full, and then suddenly, when they cut the buffet off, you're feeling pretty hungry, and it's going to cost you an awful lot to eat that same amount of food every day.
That's a hilarious analogy, and I like it. Well, so let's keep going. I mean, we've touched on the future proofing. We've touched on how this cutoff hits us hard. We've got this next. Well, is this the slide I wanted? Let me see here. We have this one other next step slide. I'm sorry, I'm fumbling around. Simon, spend a second here on what's different is a Civo alternative. And I'm getting a little ahead here, but that's okay.
That's okay. I mean, there's a little bit of it very much a Civo pitch, but it hopefully describes the trap that one's getting into. it's giving 2 examples for a hyperscaler and 2 examples for Civo. So first 2 rows, one is for a consistent spend of 50k a month, so a total of 600k a year. The other one is saying, recognizing actually reality, you kind of ramp up. You don't go from nothing to 50k on in 1 minute. You kind of probably take 6 months to ramp up. And then in that example, it's also giving a 200k credit from the hyperscaler. Okay, and then hence it reduces the amount down to $255,000 in that first year. Okay, because you've ramped up, but importantly, you've got a 200k credit. The Civo example is very fair, is the same architecture, the same use case, and it's saying, well, there's 2 things going on here. One is that the cost is so much lower, often as much as 60%. Okay, and then in the ramp-up example, we're not giving 200k of credit. We're only giving 50k of credit because we're saying just try our platform, test that it is what we've told you it is. It's as good, it's as available, it's as performant. It does what you need to do. Yeah, so you only need 50k to prove that. But it's what it's showing you that over the period, there are significant savings of circa $1 million US dollars over that 3 or 5 year period.
Yep. So having a more realistic price from the get-go ends up having significant impact over the long term, even with the huge lump of free on the front end.
Thank you. That's exactly what it's trying to demonstrate is there's this illusion that crowd credits save you money. The reality is both financially, this is demonstration that doesn't, but in our previous discussions is actually you're also trapping yourself into a long-term commitment, which you're not doing by using a cloud-native Kubernetes first platform. Yeah.
Well, so James, this is the slide I was looking for. Is what do we do about this? We've got these 3 steps laid out, but how do we talk about the governance, the other bits here that we can do to avoid these problems?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, you've got conduct what we call a portability assessment, which we can provide, but it effectively will look at your existing infrastructure to figure out dependencies and actually offer clear next steps on how to unlock yourself if you're already in that case, or what are the next steps in terms of your net new build that you would want to factor in. We've obviously got on here cost and governance safeguards, and so this really is cloud 101 and should be in the terms of those companies having clear owners, clear visibility, and I'm a big believer in making sure you're measuring the right things. And we've seen actually companies where they get their cost governance in the right place, that has actually materially impacted their business decisions on what products they push out to certain customers, knowing that and effectively understanding the full TCO is what we call it, total cost of ownership. And not just mapping that for current state, but looking into the future, which is, again, something where you want to be planning for what your infrastructure will look like in terms of scaling. So you want to be looking, sort of 3 years down the line, which, again, for some of these smaller companies just starting out, they're solely focused on the current state, which can often lead to them making certain decisions, but it ends up hindering them in the long run, as I've kind of mentioned a couple of times. We do believe that having a diverse strategy of different platforms is beneficial, not just, from you've got basically the resilience side of things in terms of disaster recovery and having that, certain backups in certain places, but true multi-cloud. And if your teams can be built in that way, you're less dependent on one particular provider, which gives you a commercial advantage in when those contracts are up for renewal. I mean, we generally advise that, customers look at shorter term commitments. We, where it makes sense, maybe even move to a pay-as-you-go model in some instances, and then leveraging, in the case of credits, maybe just using the credits for tests and development parts of your business, because that's like what it's used for, to do those iterations and then figure out, okay, once it's got working, where do I actually need to run this in the most optimal way? And there's like lots of different, and there's a checklist that we sort of shared as part of our white paper, which covers everything, as I mentioned, like the forecasting piece, the portability, looking at migration costs in itself, because if you are going to go down that one route and you plan for a migration, you should definitely include that into your forecast in terms of time and energy spent from the team, but also cost of maybe using even a third party for that. Running those scenarios. So I mentioned TCO, but what is the ROI of, and Simon just touched on it, right? Having that clear map. And there's often the case where I ask businesses for exactly what was shared by Simon, even at a high level, they don't have that in place, which shows that they're not doing the due diligence needed. And I do believe if companies get this right, it is a competitive advantage ultimately, because they will find that the amount of capital that is ended up being spent on IT infrastructure is a lot less overall. Building the skills we mentioned around that, like where you can run and operate off different platforms. I know it's quite, and I've actually worked with some recruitment companies where, how does your people plan marry you up with your technology plan? Because if you hire just solely for one provider, right, in terms of skill set, you do in turn like limit yourself. And so these are some of the key decisions that any business should be thinking about. And then finally, that ongoing cost management. So there's lots of monitoring tools out there, lots of third parties, just to make sure you've got that sort of key principles in place.
Yeah. So we've touched several times on the fact that there's a white paper related to this, and just to be clear, you will all get a copy of this white paper. There will also be a slide at the end with a QR code if you want to go download that. But we've done some significant writing about the full topic as well. So, Simon, were you about to add one thing?
No, I was going to, a couple of things I was going to touch on what James was saying there. One, that last point about training and skills. Again, a nice analogy, or it's worked for me in the past. It's like, building your garage and only having tools from Mercedes. If you do that, you know that you're only ever going to maintain Mercedes cars. You're never going to be able to, do BMWs and Audis and every other variant. The good garage buys multi-purpose tools. Give them that flexibility. I think another important thing that I've only seen rarely, a lot of people have said they do it, but I've never really seen evidence of it, is in procurement. A good procurement officer not only looks at, the cost of using the platform, migrating to it, adopting it, using it, but also they look at the migration cost. And it's that whole life cost that needs to go into the cost analysis of a cloud, not purely the onboarding part of it. And certainly, as I say, lots of procurement say that they do that. It's mandated in public sector. It doesn't happen, never happens. They purely look at that initial cost. It's the whole life cost that becomes really important here.
Yeah.
I would really emphasize like the governance piece. And that goes from setting out clear ownership. We call it the 3 R's, where you're having like real-time monitoring, role-based access, and regular reviews of and reporting of cost, usage, and ultimately tying that into your strategy. And the thing that I see catch a lot of businesses out, and this is because I think it still feels fairly new. A lot of businesses have been pushed, whether they by their investors, into clouds, and still, to some degree, trying to figure it all out. But ultimately, I think that these companies need to have clear, basically, guidelines of which they follow, from procurement all the way through to the actually technology folk within the organization spinning up net new workloads. Like, what are the sort of guiding principles that they follow? And so I think without that, you can look and assess different cloud providers, but it becomes really, really challenging.
Yeah. Well, so one slightly different angle I want to take on this is, Simon, I know something you've been very tuned into is the regulatory bodies addressing the issues related to cloud credits and vendor lock-in. How might regulations be changing in this space that'll affect the future of this space?
Yeah, I mean, this really is an international issue, and obviously, I've been very involved here in the UK, but actually throughout the world, different countries or regions have got a very different approach. It's undoubtedly being driven by two things today. One is the rise of the hyperscalers and just their dominance of the market and that lock-in that people are becoming very concerned of, either at company level or actually at a country level, the risk that potentially is there. Or if you look at people like Europe, they're as interested as the economics of it and having the value of an indigenous sovereign cloud industry, and all of the benefit that brings downstream of education, supply chains, etc. Some countries, today are very nervous about the administration that's in America at the moment, and therefore they're bringing in regulation or driving policy because of that concern. And in certain countries, you can understand that. In the UK, we have an ongoing investigation at the moment by our Competitions and Market Authority. They are looking at the dominance of both Microsoft and AWS in our market. And again, they are looking at four particular concerns. One is the migration costs and those egress fees, which are significant and absolutely used to lock people in, that it's just too expensive. Or it's not just the expense, it's the way they use it to, probably too detailed, but lock you in through egress. Okay. One is technical lock-in. You're being pushed towards proprietary features. Okay. One is around licensing and how, in particular, Microsoft is being licensed. And then there's another that I don't particularly buy into, and that they are looking at, should all clouds have the same feature set? And whereas clearly that alleviates lock-in, it also, in my opinion, alleviates innovation. And there are some great feature sets from some of these companies. And as long as you make a conscious decision of using them, I don't think there's anything wrong in doing that. The problem is, most of the times, it's not a conscious decision by the business. Yeah. So, answer your question, regulation, it's not going to be one thing. It's going to be different in different geographies, different territories, or even different vertical markets, as banks, insurance want to treat data in different ways.
Yeah. So a number of things that we've covered here already, but this, when you're being locked in, it tends to lead to 28% higher long-term costs because you're not optimizing your architecture. It can lead to these multi-quarter migration delays that stall innovation roadmaps. We've touched on that. And 70% of companies lack spending visibility, which leads to catastrophic bill shocks. So, there's this dependence on these hyperscaler promotional programs has a significant impact on in the industry, especially if you're a small startup and your number one goal is to exist this time next year. It could be taking a whole bunch of money from these folks is going to cause you problems. There's smart ways to do it. And don't say no to the free money, but think about the implications of the decisions that you're making. Simon, James, anything that I missed before we have a couple of questions from the audience I'll address, but is there any of the big picture things that we didn't touch on that you'd like to address?
I think from my side, hopefully it's been a very good conversation. I've certainly found it very interesting. I kind of summarize it that the credit trap represents a false economy, and be very conscious of that. Short-term saving masks long-term innovation and innovation paralysis and long-term debt. You can do it cheaper today by using a platform like Civo, and absolutely experts like James and Canopy, with a long history of understanding how credits are being used to lock in. You should be speaking to James for his expertise in sharing a deeper insight than we've been able to share today.
Yeah, James.
I'd echo a lot of what Simon said. I think where we've seen changes in the market, particularly new players entering, I think it's important that buyers and economic buyers of cloud understand and make the right informed decisions, simply. And more often than not, it's because they don't have access to information or they're unaware of the long-term implications. And so, like with all strategies, it's one which is really difficult to get right all the time. But hopefully this conversation has armed you with a little bit of insight that allows you to kind of maybe think about what that cloud strategy looks like. And particularly, as I sort of mentioned, when it comes to those sort of business compelling events, so whether it be entering a new market, whether it be seeing a significant increase in your usage, whether it be an M&A, whether it be a new product that you're looking to release, like these are all business compelling events which you then need to be thinking, how does that impact my cloud strategy? What does that mean for my consumption? And not only from an internal perspective, but looking at customers and having the options, and this is where we come in predominantly to help customers do that, is help them make that decision. Because often than not, if you do the work up front, it limits the issues that end up having or seeing happen, and we've seen it firsthand downstream. I think having a bit of an open mind, smart cloud management with some flexibility in terms of different options and giving yourself that flexibility will ultimately be beneficial to those businesses. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I want to put up this report. So this is the Decoding Cloud Credits report. Anybody who attended will automatically be getting a link for this, but you can scan this QR code and go download that today. That's Civo and Canopy put this together to give one sort of last hurrah pitch on these two things. So Civo is a cloud. We think about cloud differently than the hyperscalers. We are challenging them in a number of different places. The sovereignty angle, it's based out of the UK. Your data is not controlled by one of the big US hyperscalers. We think about costs differently. We think about credits differently. And we are often in the big hyperscalers. If you're using a cloud or thinking about these things, go check out Civo. And James and Canopy is a broker that's going to help you make good decisions in this space as you're looking at which cloud you want to be using and different services within that. And James, since I don't work for you, I should probably let you give that pitch, but that was my best effort. So anything to add there?
No, you're pretty much spot on. Like, we're a broker, we operate agnostically, so we do work with hyperscalers as well as the likes of Civo, all the way through to GPU as a service providers, but broadly to give customers options and effectively be an extension of their IT, procurement, finance teams. And I think joining all of those up together is what fundamentally is broken in a lot of companies, because you've got, you know, finance not talking to IT, and procurement, as Simon alluded to, is a key factor in this. And so we kind of effectively are an extension of those teams, working with the likes of Civo, which has been great.
Yeah. Well, thank you, James. Thank you, Simon, for speaking. And thank you, folks, for coming. So go take all the cloud credits, but be careful when you do. Understand the downstream effects of it. There can be problems, and be wise about it. Architect for the future. Understand what's coming, and don't shoot yourself in the foot. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Download that white paper, take a look, and if you had a question that you didn't get answered today, there was one that came in that I decided actually was maybe very specific to that one person. So if you have a question that you want answered, please feel free to reach out to any of us. I'm sure we'd be happy to get in touch and talk with you about those. And thanks for coming. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.